In this video, I want to explore violence and the correlation between violence and violation. And this is a riffing video, and I'll begin by saying one of the reasons I think it's important to understand violence and the crescendo of energy where mental emotional violence penetrates into the density of physical form. And one of the reasons I think that's important is that I've had relatively little violence in terms of physicality in my life. In my adult life, I think physical violence has taken less than 30 seconds. And in three of the cases, it's if there's an energy behind it and it's asserting a boundary. I remember one woman who'd cornered me and was shouting at a point that I couldn't get by her. And a single shove with the palm of my hand into her sternum shocked her out of the rage, and then we were able to amicably, move around. Violence, in that sense, as a boundary, can prevent a significant amount of pain later, and that's the area where I think violence is most useful. It's when someone's crossing a boundary that's going to cause extraordinary pain later, killing your wife, whatever it is, and a relatively small and short amount of violence is going to stop that happening. The other time I think violence is helpful is in a bullying dynamic where one person is pushing into areas that are causing a lot of pain. A big example, someone's rolling some large rocks and they're gathering speed and hitting people below at a point that's causing a lot of pain. It takes a little bit of effort to roll the rock or a little bit of effort to pull the trigger, but the person that is excreting the violence is doing so with very little effort and very little inconvenience. And one form of violence is an expression of a sociopathic state. In this case, the person is numb. They're not feeling anything emotionally. They're not connected empathically to another person. As a result, the violence that they're expressing is not affecting them. Now, by transferring the pain that they're causing back to them briefly, picking up one of the rocks they're throwing at others and hitting them over the head with it, suddenly they get, there's a connection here. If I hurt other people, they hurt me. I'm in a sociopathic state, meaning I'm not tuned in to my caring for other people at this point, but I am still connected to my survival instinct for myself. So these are a couple of instances where violence can be useful. But what's much more difficult and I think in many ways important to work with is the emotional insensitivity particularly around trauma. Trauma is a biological state where the emotions present represent a perceived threat of existence. And when it's not resolved, when trauma exists as a biological state that has not been cleared, the biology of the chemicals of terror, of fight, flight, freeze, etc., are not out of the system, which can be a decade later if and when there's not knowledge about trauma and when the traumatic response got suppressed because in many cases when you're being abused, if you defend or go into fight, flight, freeze to protect yourself, the abuser escalates the abuse. So this creates a situation where the person begins to defend themselves and then freezes that part that's trying to express, creating a tug of war inside. And so these chemicals don't release because one part is saying run for your life and the other part is saying if you run it'll be worse. So that it's kind of a gridlock where there's no way, there's still the part that wants to run, but in that kind of situation, at peak emotional moments, we can dissociate, and the chemicals are still kind of locked in. One, run, and the other, don't run, don't upset the aggressor. And these are two competing survival strategies, an instinctual animal strategy and then a social strategy. Because tigers don't attack you more because you ran. But, for example, a vindictive woman or an aggressive man may say, if you run, I'm going to make it worse for you. And so you have the ability with the human being to have two survival strategies both warring with one another in the body. And this is one of the reasons that human beings get PTSD. Very few animals do. And PTSD is this sense, there's this terrified part that never releases, maybe 4 years old, and it's like it's still buried there, all this terror, all this tension, all this chemical in the brain that did not get to fully express itself, because before it could release the chemical biologically, that adrenaline and stuff, then a new wave comes in, and don't do that or you'll be hated, or you'll be all alone, or you'll look dumb. And so now they're in tension. But when there's insensitivity emotionally, and the biggest one can be to trauma, for example, you've been for a man, one of the worst things is to be sexually abused by another man. This is almost impossible to deal with in this culture because while there are a large number of sexual abuses in this culture produces sexual abusers, there's very little education about it. We systematically expose children to it by refusing to deal with it head on. And secondly, men are shamed for being out of control. Well, you are when you're abused. Men are shamed for being effeminate. Well, you are when you're sexually abused by another man. And so there's all these setups where it's this horrific trauma and then a culture where you are shamed for trying to talk about it, because if a 14-year-old boy talks about being raped by another man, the level of sociopathic stupidity in our culture is very much likely to set him up to be bullied and teased. It's kind of the worst possible thing to do, but that's what you do in an emotionally illiterate culture. So let's say this shame, bullying dynamic is in place, and in a culture that is as chauvinistic and as ours, in which anything effeminate is instantly attacked. And, it, as a healthy child, it's like, what are you guys idiots doing? But as you learn that you cannot fight the system, one of the things, and again, an inner conflict that we create is now we internalize the abuser. Once you've been teased and bullied enough for being effeminate, now a healthy feminine emotion comes up, kindness or caring or creativity. That emotion surfaces in the person who's been shamed and bullied, and they will now shame and bully themselves before anyone else can do it, because there's a greater sense of power and control. I shut this down. Well, why did you shut it down? Well, I shut it down because I know from experience that if I don't, I'm going to be shamed, humiliated, and bullied, and so I shut it down. But there's more of a sense of control. I did it, as opposed to it was helplessly done to me. And helplessness is one of the emotions that is most vulnerable, because helplessness means that nobody will help. And in animal and biological terms, when no one will help, when no one will come to your aid in a traumatic moment, it means you're not belonging to the pack. And if you don't belong to the pack as a monkey, as a chimp, etc., you die. It's that simple. We're pack mammalian animals. And so this is the sense of ostracization, the helpless feeling. I desperately need help and I can't help myself and no one is helping me. If someone is helping me, I do not feel helpless. If they're showing up. But when I'm helpless, this is a devastating emotion because it triggers the sense I'm going to die. People will do almost anything to get out of helplessness. And in social terms, where helplessness expresses itself is not so much the physical body dying, but the social, the emotional body dying. When someone keeps sadistically tying you up into knots and making you look like an idiot, and then the people that you want to like you and etc. start humiliating you, this is creating a helplessness. Because it's in Maslow's hierarchy of needs: survival, security, love, and belonging. Now you have some asshole at a party who's just tightening the strings, making sure there's no way that you can meet that need of love and belonging, that you're going to feel ostracized, humiliated, etc. again and again and again. And then other people are not helping you, they're joining in laughing at the witty jokes and enjoying your humiliation, etc., in flirting with the person who's being a dick. Then in this kind of situation, this helplessness is going to grow, and if it can't be resolved mentally, and this is one of the reasons why an education is useful for de-escalating violence. The I'm going to sock you one, tends to come from people that have that feeling of helplessness and they have no way to turn. People who are similarly witty and articulate and intelligent will just send a few zingers back, because everyone has vulnerabilities, and if someone's directing all their hostility towards you, you send them a few zings back, and few laughs go the other way, and usually they get the message and they try and pick on someone who cannot stand up for themselves on a verbal and mental level. And this is just practice. You get more practice in college, etc. So, but when emotions are violated, you get into the insults about your mother and stuff like that. When emotions are violated, you find the area where someone has a feeling, and then you ping them in a sensitive area. This will escalate into violence. Now, another area where violence escalates is the shame. Well, I had this with my wife earlier tonight. There was a movie scene in which I understood the deep pain and humiliation that a man was going through in the movie. And my wife was oblivious. But I was going through that pain with the movie character. And, it was exploding in my body. And, my wife's out to lunch about this. In other words, she's not showing sensitivity to the guy, and she's not showing sensitivity to the part of me that knows exactly what that guy is dealing with. And so I try and draw her attention. Can you understand what? And it was actually an interesting thing where the mother of the male character was really turning the knife and being about as cruel as a mother could be emotionally, withholding love, withholding affection, withholding any sense of belonging, withholding honor, speaking about her shame. And it was particularly aggravating because it was the mother who was way out of line. So this mother is being a bitch, basically, and a coward. But rather than owning her inadequacy in this scene to mother, she was shaming her son. And I could see the way that it was twisting, bringing out the worst in him, and also in later life as the film progressed, making him susceptible to hurt other people in the way that his mother had hurt him. And in the chauvinism of our culture, as we've now turned the spotlight onto the negativity of men, one of the things that we don't acknowledge is that the inadequacy of mothering plays an enormous role in the production of men in a sociopathic state. Because boys need mothers who are capable of loving, who are capable of going outside themselves, who will protect the feminine, the emotions, the felt experience, the innocence of that man. And if rather than protecting that innocence and that felt experience of the man, the mother ignores it, shames it, denigrates it, betrays it repeatedly, the innocence dies. There's a death of soul at a certain level. And the man will dissociate from his own innocence because it hurts too much to have the person most important to you shaming and hammering away at that. And that same moment of dissociation to process the pain of the inadequate mother then translates into the ability to be as cruel to other women and men, and particularly the feminine in men and women, as the mother is to the feminine in the son. I'm not talking about the mother, you have quite sexually aggressive mothers, constantly doting on the looks of their son, or invasively invading into the girlfriend arena and stuff like that. But if at the same time she's shaming, ignoring, humiliating his feminine side, his sensitivity, his feelings, etc., that's not love. Or if anything, it's an invasive, abusive love towards the masculine in terms of the seductive mother, while abandoning and shaming the feminine in that man. Well, that is going to hurt very deeply. And in a culture like ours, where we don't spend a single hour in high school on a single bit of biology about emotion, a single scientific understanding of the color wheel of emotion, how this emotion turns into this emotion, how, for example, hate requires an element of helplessness. If there's no helplessness, there's no hate. If hate is present, you know that helplessness is part of the mix. This is chemistry, emotional chemistry. We just don't learn it. We learn physical chemistry, which hardly any of us need. And we don't learn emotional chemistry as part of the chauvinism of our culture, which we all need. Every single one of us is building their life from the motivation of emotions. Every human action in human history has been built from human emotions. And when we do ourselves the profound disservice of expressing our ignorance and chauvinism without teaching children something this basic to our humanity, we get emotionally illiterate people who then use the culture's chauvinism and stupidity to shame themselves for having feelings, for not knowing why they do. And of course we don't know why we do, because we have idiots setting the education curriculum. But that, and it's bizarre, because you have such a level of dense ignorance that the typical person doesn't get what a huge vacuum it is when a third of the human experience is emotional, to not study emotions. This emotion plus this emotion at this intensity equals this. The probability of combining these things, and these things in a social situation equals this. These cultures dealt with emotions in this way. These are the names for all of the emotions. Here's how to turn hurt into anger. Here's how to turn anger into hurt. Here's how to turn rage into physical motivation to get something done. Here's how to turn fear into anger. Here's how to de-escalate hate by removing powerless. We just don't learn these things, and they're basic. It doesn't take long. It's just in a culture that denies the feminine as we do. Emotions are the feminine part in every man and woman. They're fluid, they're constantly changing, and they're the driving force of every man and woman. So anyway, my wife spaced out on what this man was going through. And she continued to space out. And I noticed there was a part of me that wanted to hit her so that she would feel. See, because here's what was going on for me. And, as I say, I've spent less than 30 seconds of my life in physical violence in, relatively appropriate manners. But we can learn an enormous amount by our impulses. And so what's going on when I'm feeling this deep pain of this man and my wife's dissociating? And then I'm pointing her to it, and she's still dissociating it. And she's looking at this pain as if, like, how could you possibly know what's going on there? And the combination of the dissociation and also, one of the violations is I want empathy. I want empathy from my wife for this man, and I want empathy from my wife for this part of myself, but I'm not getting it. I'm getting dissociation. So I want and need empathy, and I'm getting dissociation. So there's a friction there. A need, the need is not being met. So this is the first level of violation. Need not being met. The next is a violation of understanding. I need you to understand this so that I know that you understand me. And she doesn't. And that's a violation. Well, the pain is still there. And then I need a mechanism to help you understand. And my wife is clueless in this area. So she doesn't know how to ask the questions or show me where she doesn't understand this. She's just like, well, what do you want me to say? And I don't want, I want someone who can. So there's this gap between what I'm wanting and how she's showing up in a very painful area. And I have no idea how to get her to empathize in this situation, because to me it's obvious. And this kind of logic is not her strong point. So if she doesn't empathize with something on her own, she's not necessarily going to do it. And I feel her spaciness around this, and I want her to get that this is important. And the impulse to, just give her a slap is bring her into her body, number one. Number two, get that this is hurting me, that she's nowhere around in this issue. Three, join me in feeling the pain that this man and now me, and let's feel this pain together, of this abusive woman in the film. And I can't, I can't bring her into that envelope. And I feel alone then in this very strong pain. Now, obviously hitting my wife is not it's not an appropriate use of force, so I don't do it. But I turn what I do is I criticize my wife. Show up, wake up, pay attention here. Imagine what this is like. So I express the anger with irritation. I express the hurt with criticism. And then my wife feels, she doesn't feel what I'm feeling. She doesn't know what about that guy, but now she doesn't like being criticized. So now she's, turning away. And that's frustrating as well. It's like, I still don't get someone who understands this issue. But I have at least communicated that it's a big deal for me. So there's mixed results. But this is a very important matrix in understanding how violence can be created, how can it be mitigated, and it's very important to understand that we are all capable of violence, because once you understand that, the question is, what elicits violence for me? Number one. And two, what is escalating violence? And three, how escalated am I in the moment? For example, the moment if I feel like hitting someone, whether it's someone I like or don't like, in this case I love my wife, that's a time that if she is helpless to do what I need for her to help de-escalate, to remove my pain by empathizing, by being there, I need to dissociate from her a bit, which is, what I did was, it's like, okay, you can't be there for me in the way that I need for this pain to go down. So go do something you like to do, and I will deal with this. As soon as she's gone, now there's not someone in the room who doesn't understand this. I'm the only one in the room, and I do understand it. And so there's a de-escalation, a calming down. But this is very basic stuff around violation and violation of need, but violation of boundaries, violations of sensitive areas, violations of trauma triggers. If you've got regressed trauma that has not been dealt with, which a majority of Americans do, and someone says the wrong thing in the wrong moment, it's going to trigger an explosion of chemicals in the body that person has not been trained to deal with in a trauma-illiterate culture. And if you don't take the time with the people close to you to understand what those triggers are. Hello, most of us have trauma. Do you know what trauma is? No, I have no idea. I'm an American. Okay, well, could we read these books together? And I'd like you to understand, and I'd like you to tell me what your trauma triggers are, so that I don't inadvertently throw you into an overwhelmed space where I violated boundaries, where you're in massive amounts of fear or pain, and the only way you know how to manage the space in the moment is to hit me. I don't want to put you in that situation. So help educate me on your triggers, and I'll consciously partner with you to minimize those triggers. I will not press those buttons if I can help it. This is part of respecting energy, respecting biology, respecting feelings, respecting probability fields, and making it easy for a partner, for someone to not escalate emotional violation, etc., into physical violence. So, a few riffs for today.